The Everyday Life of Abraham Lincoln, by Francis Fisher Browne. Chapter 1a. Ancestry, the Lincolns in Kentucky, Death of Lincoln's grandfather, Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Hanks, Mordecai Lincoln, Birth of Abraham Lincoln, Removal to Indiana, Early Years, Dennis Hanks, Lincoln's boyhood, Death of Nancy Hanks. The year 1809, that year which gave William E. Gladstone to England, was in our country the birth year of him who wears the most distinguished name that has yet been written on the pages of American history, Abraham Lincoln. In a rude cabin, in a clearing, in the wilds of that section which was once the hunting ground and later the battlefield of the Cherokees and other warlike tribes, and which the Indians themselves had named Kentucky because it was dark and bloody ground, the great war President of the United States, after whose name history has written the word Emancipator, first saw the light. Born and nurtured in penury, inured to hardship, coarse food, and scanty clothing, the story of his youth is full of pathos. Small wonder that when asked in his later years to tell something of his early life, he replied by quoting a line from Gray's Elegy, "The short and simple annals of the poor." Lincoln's ancestry has been traced with tolerable certainty through 5 generations to Samuel Lincoln of Norfolk County, England. Not many years after the landing of the Mayflower at Plymouth, perhaps in the year 1638, Samuel Lincoln's son Mordecai had emigrated to Hingham, Massachusetts. Perhaps because he was a Quaker, a then persecuted sect, he did not remain long at Hingham, but came westward as far as Berks County, Pennsylvania. His son, John Lincoln, went southward from Pennsylvania and settled in Rockingham County, Virginia. Later, in 1782, while the last events of the American Revolution were in progress, Abraham Lincoln, son of John and grandfather of President Lincoln, moved into Kentucky and took up a tract of government land in Mercer County. In the field book of Daniel Boone, the Kentucky pioneer, now in possession of the Wisconsin Historical Society, appears the following note of purchase: Abraham Lincoln enters 500 acres of land on a treasury warrant on the south side of Licking Creek or river in Kentucky. At this time Kentucky was included within the limits and jurisdiction of Virginia. In 1775 Daniel Boone had built a fort at Boonesboro on the Kentucky River, and it was not far from this site that Abraham Lincoln, President Lincoln's grandfather, located his claim and put up a rude log hut for the shelter of his family. The pioneers of Kentucky cleared small spaces and erected their humble dwellings. They had to contend not only with the wild forces of nature, and to defend themselves from the beasts of the forest. More to be feared than either were the hostile Indians. The settlers were filled with terror of these stealthy foes. At home and abroad they kept their guns ready for instant use both night and day. Many a hard battle was fought between the Indian and the pioneer. Many an unguarded woodsman was shot down without warning while busy about his necessary work. Among these was Abraham Lincoln. The story of his death is related by Mr. I.N. Arnold. Thomas Lincoln was with his father in the field when the savages suddenly fell upon them. Mordecai and Josiah, his elder brothers, were near by in the forest. Mordecai, startled by a shot, saw his father fall, and running to the cabin, seized the loaded rifle, rushed to one of the loopholes cut through the logs of the cabin, and saw the Indian who had fired. He had just caught the boy, Thomas, and was running toward the forest. Pointing the rifle through the logs and aiming at a medal on the breast of the Indian, Mordecai fired. The Indian fell, and springing to his feet, the boy ran to the open arms of his mother at the cabin door. Meanwhile, Josiah, who had run to the fort for aid, returned with a party of settlers. The bodies of Abraham Lincoln and the Indian who had been killed were brought in. From this time forth, Mordecai Lincoln was the mortal enemy of the Indian, and it is said that he sacrificed many in revenge for the murder of his father. In the presence of such dangers Thomas Lincoln spent his boyhood. He was born in 1778, and could not have been much more than 4 years old on that fatal day when in one swift moment his father lay dead beside him, and vengeance had been exacted by his resolute boy brother. It was such experiences as these that made of the pioneers the sturdy men they were. They acquired habits of heroism. Their sinews became wiry. their nerves turned to steel, their senses became sharpened, they grew alert, steady, prompt, and deft in every emergency. Of Mordecai Lincoln, the boy who had exhibited such coolness and daring on the day of his father's death, many stories are told after he reached manhood. "He was naturally a man of considerable genius," says one who knew him. "He was a man of great drollery. It would almost make you laugh to look at him. I never saw but one other man who excited in me the same disposition to laugh, and that was Artemus Ward." Abe Lincoln had a very high opinion of his uncle, and on one occasion remarked that Uncle Mord had run off with all the talents of the family. Thomas Lincoln was 28 years old before he sought a wife. His choice fell upon a young woman of 23, whose name was Nancy Hanks. Like her husband, she was of English descent. Like his, her parents had followed in the path of emigration from Virginia to Kentucky. The couple were married by the Rev. Jesse Head, a Methodist minister located at Springfield, Washington County, Kentucky. They lived for a time in Elizabethtown, but after the birth of their first child, Sarah, they removed to Rock Spring Farm on Nolan Creek, in Hardin, afterward LaRue County. In this desolate spot, a strange and unlikely place for the birth of one destined to play so memorable a part in the history of the world, on the 12th day of February, 1809, Abraham Lincoln, the President, was born. Of all the gross injustice ever done to the memory of woman, that which has been accorded to Nancy Hanks is the greatest. The story which cast a shadow upon her parentage, and on that of her illustrious son as well, should be sternly relegated to the oblivion whence it came. Mr. Henry Watterson, in his brilliant address on Lincoln, refers to him as "that strange incomparable man, of whose parentage we neither know nor care." In some localities, particularly in Kentucky and South Carolina, the rumor is definite and persistent that the President was not the son of Thomas Lincoln, the illiterate and thriftless, but of one Colonel Hardin, for whom Hardin County was named; that Nancy Hanks was herself the victim of unlegalized motherhood, the natural daughter of an aristocratic, wealthy, and well-educated Virginia planter, and that this accounted for many of her son's characteristics. The story has long since been disproved. Efforts to verify it brought forth the fact that it sprang into being in the early days of the Civil War, and was evidently a fabrication born of the bitter spirit of the hour. It was not from his father, however, that Lincoln inherited any of his remarkable traits. The dark, coarse hair, the gray eyes, sallow complexion, and brawny strength, which were his, constituted his sole inheritance on the paternal side. But Nancy Hanks was gentle and refined, and would have adorned any station in life. She was beautiful in youth, with dark hair, regular features, and soft, sparkling hazel eyes. She was unusually intelligent, and read all the books she could obtain. Says Mr. Arnold, "She was a woman of deep religious feeling, of the most exemplary character, and most tenderly and affectionately devoted to her family. Her home indicated a love of beauty exceptional in the wild settlement in which she lived, and judging from her early death, it is probable that she was of a physique less hardy than that of those among whom she lived. Hers was a strong, self-reliant spirit, which commanded the love and respect of the rugged people among whom she dwelt." The tender and reverent spirit of Abraham Lincoln, and the pensive melancholy of his disposition, he no doubt inherited from his mother. Amid the toil and struggle of her busy life, she found time not only to teach him to read and write, but to impress upon him ineffaceably that love of truth and justice, that perfect integrity and reverence for God, for which he was noted all his life. Lincoln always looked upon his mother with unspeakable affection, and never ceased to cherish the memory of her life and teaching. A spirit of restlessness, a love of adventure, a longing for new scenes, and possibly the hope of improving his condition, led Thomas Lincoln to abandon the Rock Spring Farm in the fall of 1816 and begin life over again in the wilds of southern Indiana. The way thither lay through unbroken country and was beset with difficulties. Often the travelers were obliged to cut their road as they went. With the resolution of pioneers, however, they began the journey. At the end of several days they had gone but 18 miles. Abraham Lincoln was then not but 7 years old, but was already accustomed to the use of axe and gun. He lent a willing hand, and bore his share in the labor and fatigue connected with the difficult journey. In after years he said that he had never passed through a more trying experience than when he went from Thompson's Ferry to Spencer County, Indiana. On arriving, a shanty for immediate use was hastily erected. 3 sides were enclosed, the 4th remaining open. This served as a home for several months, when a more comfortable cabin was built. On the 18th of October, 1817, Thomas Lincoln entered a quarter section of government land 18 miles north of the Ohio River and about a mile and a half from the present village of Gentryville. About a year later they were followed by the family of Thomas and Betsy Sparrow, relatives of Mrs. Lincoln and old-time neighbors on the Rock Spring farm in Kentucky. Dennis Hanks, a member of the Sparrow household and cousin of Abraham Lincoln, came also. He has furnished some recollections of the President's boyhood, which are well worth recording. Uncle Dennis, as he was familiarly called, was himself a striking character, a man of original manners and racy conversation. A sketch of him as he appeared to an observer in his later days is thus given. Uncle Dennis is a typical Kentuckian, born in Hardin County in 1799. His face is sun-bronzed and plowed with the furrows of time, but he has a resolute mouth, a firm grip of the jaws, and a broad forehead above a pair of piercing eyes. The eyes seem out of place in the weary, faded face, but they glow and flash like 2 diamond sparks set in ridges of dull gold. The face is a serious one, but the play of light in the eyes, unquenchable by time, betrays a nature of sunshine and elate with life. A glance at the profile shows a face strikingly Lincoln-like, prominent cheekbones, temple, nose, and chin, but best of all is that twinkling drollery in the eye that flashed in the White House during the dark days of the Civil War. Uncle Dennis's recollections go back to the birth of Abraham Lincoln. To use his own words, "I ricollect I run all the way, over 2 miles, to see Nancy Hanks's boy baby. Her name was Nancy Hanks before she married Thomas Lincoln. 'Twas common for connections to gather in them days to see new babies. I held the wee one a minute. I was 10 years old, and it tickled me to hold the pulpy, red little Lincoln. The family moved to Indiana," he went on, "when Abe was about 9. Mr. Lincoln moved first and built a camp of brush in Spencer County. We came a year later, and he had then a cabin, so he gave us the shanty. Abe killed a turkey the day we got there, and couldn't get through tellin' us about it. The name was pronounced Linkhorn by the folks then. We was all uneducated. After a spell we learnt better. I was the only boy in the place all them years, and Abe and me was always together." Dennis Hanks claims to have taught his young cousin to read, write, and cipher. He knew his letters pretty wellish, but no more. His mother had taught him. If ever there was a good woman on earth, she was one. A true Christian of the Baptist Church, but she died soon after we arrived, and Abe was left without a teacher. His father couldn't read a word. The boy had only about 1/4 of schooling, hardly that. I then set in to help him. I didn't know much, but I did the best I could. Sometimes he would write with a piece of charcoal or the point of a burnt stick on the fence or floor. We got a little paper at the country town, and I made some ink out of blackberry briar root and a little copperas in it. It was black, but the copperas ate the paper after a while. I made Abe's first pen out of a turkey buzzard feather. We had no geese them days. After he learned to write his name, he was scrawlin' it everywhere. Sometimes he would write it in the white sand down by the crick bank, and leave it there till the waves would blot it out. He didn't take to books in the beginnin'. We had to hire him at first, but after he got a taste on it, it was the old story. We had to pull the sow's ears to get her to the trough, and then pull her tail to get her away. He read a great deal, and had a wonderful memory, wonderful. Never forgot anything. Lincoln's first reading book was Webster's Speller. "When I got him through that," said Uncle Dennis, "I had only a copy of the Indiana statutes. Then Abe got hold of a book. I can't ricollect the name. It told a yarn about a feller, a nigger or suthin', that sailed a flatboat up to a rock, and the rock was magnetized and drawed all the nails out, and he got a duckin' or drowned or suthin'. I forget now." It was the Arabian Nights. Abe would lay on the floor with a chair under his head and laugh over them stories by the hour. I told him they was likely lies from beginnin' to end, but he learned to read right well in them. I borrowed for him the Life of Washington, and the speeches of Henry Clay. They had a powerful influence on him. He told me afterwards in the White House he wanted to live like Washington. His speeches show it, too. But the other book did the most amazin' work. Abe was a Democrat, like his father and all of us, when he began to read it. When he closed it, he was a Whig, heart and soul, and he went on step by step till he became leader of the Republicans." These reminiscences of Dennis Hanks give the clearest and undoubtedly the most accurate glimpse of Lincoln's youth. He says further, referring to the boy's unusual physical strength, "My, how he would chop! His axe would flash and bite into a sugar tree or sycamore, and down it would come. If you heard him fellin' trees in a clearin', you would say there was 3 men at work, the way the trees fell. Abe was never sassy or quarrelsome. I've seen him walk into a crowd of sawin' rowdies, and tell some droll yarn and bust them all up. It was the same after he got to be a lawyer. All eyes was on him whenever he riz. There was suthin' peculiarsome about him. I moved from Indiana to Illinois when Abe did. I bought a little improvement near him, 6 miles from Decatur. Here the famous rails were split that were carried round in the campaign. They were called his rails, but you never can tell. I split some of 'em. He was a master hand at maulin' rails. I heard him say in a speech once, 'If I didn't make these, I made many just as good.'" Then the crowd yelled. One of his playmates has furnished much that is of interest in regard to the reputation which Lincoln left behind him in the neighborhood where he passed his boyhood and much of his youth. This witness says, "Whenever the court was in session he was a frequent attendant. John A. Breckinridge was the foremost lawyer in the community, and was famed as an advocate in criminal cases. Lincoln was sure to be present when he spoke. Doing the chores in the morning, he would walk to Booneville, the county seat of Warwick County, 17 miles away, then home in time to do the chores at night, repeating this day after day. The lawyer soon came to know him. Years afterwards, when Lincoln was President, a venerable gentleman one day entered his office in the White House, and standing before him said, 'Mr. President, you don't know me.' Mr. Lincoln eyed him sharply for a moment, and then quickly replied with a smile, 'Yes, I do. You are John A. Breckinridge. I used to walk 34 miles a day to hear you plead law in Booneville, and listening to your speeches at the bar first inspired me with the determination to be a lawyer.'" Lincoln's love for his gentle mother, and his grief over her untimely death, is a touching story. Attacked by a fatal disease, the life of Nancy Hanks wasted slowly away. Day after day her son sat by her bed, reading to her such portions of the Bible as she desired to hear. At intervals she talked to him, urging him to walk in the paths of honor, goodness, and truth. At last she found rest, and her son gave way to grief that could not be controlled. In an opening in the timber a short distance from the cabin, sympathizing friends and neighbors laid her body away, and offered sincere prayers above her grave. The simple service did not seem to the son adequate tribute to the memory of the beloved mother whose loss he so sorely felt, but no minister could be procured at the time to preach a funeral sermon. In the spring, however, Abraham Lincoln, then a lad of 10, wrote to Elder Elkin, who had lived near them in Kentucky, begging that he would come and preach a sermon above his mother's grave, and adding that by granting this request he would confer a lasting favor upon his father, his sister, and himself. Although it involved a journey of more than 100 miles on horseback, the good man cheerfully complied. Once more the neighbors and friends gathered about the grave of Nancy Hanks, and her son found comfort in their sympathy and their presence. The spot where Lincoln's mother lies is now enclosed within a high iron fence. At the head of the grave a white stone, simple, unaffected, and in keeping with the surroundings, has been placed. It bears the following inscription: Nancy Hanks Lincoln, mother of President Lincoln, died October 5, A.D. 1818, aged 35 years. Erected by a friend of her martyred son. Lincoln always held the memory of his mother in the deepest reverence and affection. Says Dr. J.G. Holland, long after her sensitive heart and weary hands had crumbled into dust, and had climbed to life again in forest flowers, he said to a friend with tears in his eyes, "All that I am or ever hope to be I owe to my sainted mother." The vacant place of wife and mother was sadly felt in the Lincoln cabin, but before the year 1819 had closed, it was filled by a woman who nobly performed the duties of her trying position. Thomas Lincoln had known Mrs. Sarah Johnston when both were young and living in Elizabethtown, Kentucky. They had married in the same year, and now, being alike bereaved, he persuaded her to unite their broken households into one. By this union A son and 2 daughters, John, Sarah, and Matilda, were added to the Lincoln family. All dwelt together in perfect harmony, the mother showing no difference in the treatment of her own children and the 2 now committed to her charge. She exhibited a special fondness for the little Abraham, whose precocious talents and enduring qualities she was quick to apprehend. Though he never forgot the angel mother sleeping on the forest-covered hilltop, the boy rewarded with a profound and lasting affection the devoted care of her who proved a faithful friend and helper during the rest of his childhood and youth. In her later life the step-mother spoke of him always with the tenderest feeling. On one occasion she said, "He never gave me a cross word or look, and never refused, in fact or appearance, to do anything I requested of him." Chapter 1a.